She hasn't been raised to be this. And she finds herself in this situation, and now she finds herself in a worse situation, that I've now got to do something that may cost me my life. It took great courage for her to do this. But she did it for her people. And she didn't do it because she was a special person. She did it because her uncle reminded her, it just may be that God put you in this place for this reason. And as it turned out, they were able to save their people, and this wicked man Haman and all of their enemies, the king allowed them to destroy their enemies and gave his troops to help them do that so that they were able to save their people. This young woman undoubtedly was raised up by God for just such a time as that. And of course, if you look through the Bible at more familiar people, what about Joseph? I'm quite convinced that Joseph, and I will relate the story for those of you who are not as familiar as most of us are with the story, but I'm quite convinced when Joseph found out that his brothers were planning on to sell him in slavery because they were all jealous of him, he was the father's favorite. First they were going to kill him, and then one of them talked the others out, no, we'll just sell him into slavery. And he was taken down to Egypt. And he was wound up being the servant of a man. He became a good servant. The man promoted him. His wife lied about him, and he was thrown in jail. I can't imagine Joseph, during this terrible ordeal he's going through, saying, well, I'm pretty sure God has a plan for me, that he's going to raise me up and make me a great person in Egypt and wind up saving my family. No. But what Joseph did was remain faithful to God. In this terrible situation, he didn't say, why me, Lord? I think I'll quit believing in you because you've let me suffer like this. He remained faithful to God. He was in prison over 2 years. And then because God gave him the ability to interpret dreams, Pharaoh found out about it. He was taken out of the prison. He interpreted these dreams that had been bothering Pharaoh. And it turned out there was going to be a great famine in the land. And so Pharaoh said, who in the land is wiser than this man? And he put him over everything. Only Pharaoh was higher in the country. Ultimately, Moses' family, who were starving up in Canaan, had to come down to ask Egypt, because Joseph had collected all this grain so they would be able to take care of the people because he knew about the famine. And so they come down, and Joseph takes care of his family. In Genesis chapter 50, we learn that Joseph has figured out that he had a purpose. He's figured out that God brought him there for such a time as this. His father has died now in Egypt, and his brothers are all worried about him taking revenge on them. After all, they really treated him terribly. And so they come to Joseph, and behold, they say, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it, and meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them. Joseph came to realize he had a purpose. And that through all of that was going on, that I'm sure he felt like asking why me sometime, that God was just preparing him to save his people, to save his family, which of course he did. What about Moses? Again, most of you, most everybody knows about Moses. People that never read the Bible have seen movies, the Ten Commandments and things like that. So we know about Moses and the great leader of the Jewish people. But what about Moses? I'm going to read you a passage that you may not have thought much about in relation to this. In Acts chapter 7, one of the disciples of Jesus, by name Stephen, has gotten in trouble preaching the gospel, and some Jews that didn't like to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ have brought him before the council, and he's going to be, he's on trial for his life, basically. He's supposed to defend himself, but Stephen isn't interested in defending himself. He's interested in teaching these people the truth. And so he begins to take them back and remind them about the Jews in the past. His point is ultimately going to be that time after time, the Jewish people have been unfaithful to God, and so are you today, he's telling them. But as he goes back through their history, and verse 22 of Acts 7, he tells them about Moses. He says, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. Now, we know the story. one of the pharaohs had said, the Jews are getting too numerous. I want the Israelites. And I'm commanding that every boy child is to be killed. And Moses' mother made a little basket that would be waterproof, put it in the Nile, had his sister watch over it to see what would happen to him. And Pharaoh's daughter happened to discover him. And his sister said, do you want a nurse from the Hebrews? She said, yes. And so we know that Moses' mother was around when he was growing up, at least in his childhood. And here we read, but when Moses was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. Verse 25 is the key here. Now think about this. For he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him. But they did not understand. Now think about that a minute, because there's nothing about that in Exodus. We don't know what his mother told him when he was growing up, but it's quite possible that much like Mordecai, his mother said, you know, son, this all has happened very much from the providence of God. And who knows what's going to happen, but you may be in a position sometime to save your people. Well, the problem is, and that's obviously conjecture, we don't know what she said, but we do know he expected the people to understand that he was their deliverer. God hadn't told him to be a deliverer yet. God hadn't said, go do this, Moses. And so what happened with Moses here is he got in a lot of trouble. Pharaoh finds out he's murdered one of his, killed one of his, I wouldn't call it murder since he was defending someone, but killed one of his men, and Moses has to flee for his life at the age of 40. In the prime of life, getting ready, he thinks, to deliver Israel. He finds out, no, you're not delivering anybody except yourself. And he goes out into the wilderness, and for the next 40 years of his life, he's a humble shepherd, shepherding sheep. Because he wasn't ready to deliver God's people. He was a very important man in Egypt. God doesn't want very important people to serve him. He wants humble people. At the end of those 40 years, God, near Mount Sinai, spoke to him from a burning bush and said, in essence, okay, now it's time. Moses, I want you to lead my people. And in Exodus chapter 4, we find that Moses is not quite ready in his own mind now. You know, before he thought the people would understand it. He was ready to lead the people. But in chapter 4 of Exodus, he says, you know, I'm not eloquent. He said, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past. Or since you have spoken to your servant. You haven't given me any power, Lord, is basically saying, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. I don't want to do it. That's what he's saying. I don't want to do it. In fact, he argues with God. Send somebody else. Here's what God answered him. Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? In other words, if I call you to do something, I'll help you do it. And ultimately, in strong terms, he tells Moses, you're going to lead the people. And Moses becomes a great leader of the people and does lead them out of Egypt. Because finally, the time was ready for Moses to do it. Not when Moses thought, but when God said, you're ready. After 80 years, Moses was now the humble servant that God needed. And so, he saved the people of Israel. What about our time, brethren? You know, we look around us and our time's fairly peaceful. I know there's a war going on right now. But here at home, we're a fairly peaceful situation. We don't have to worry, as the first century Christians did, that somebody might come in here and shut us down and say, you're not going to worship that God because he offends the emperor. And so we go about our daily lives, hopefully trying to be faithful Christians, but with the idea, you know, who am I? And what can I do? Here's what we are all expected to do every day of our lives. In Matthew chapter 5, our Lord tells us the purpose of his disciples. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the